All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast, today's live stream. Good to see everyone there. Good to see everyone reminding us that we're like a couple of minutes late. So thanks as usual. We really appreciate that feedback. But I've got a good show for you today because this is someone that I've been following when it comes to sort of the coverage of the reaction and the protests around the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I thought, this would be a really cool person to talk to discuss how those protests have been panning out, what the reaction has been like. So first and foremost, please help me welcome to the show, Elad Eliahu. Am I saying that right, Elad?
Yeah, and that's actually the best pronunciation I've gotten in a while because people usually butcher it. But Sham, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, man, it's a pleasure. So like I said, I've been following you for a while. I've been watching your videos. They keep popping up on my timeline on Twitter. I've been enjoying them. But before we, get cracking and talk a little bit more, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
So my name is Elad Eliahu. I am a 27-year-old freelance reporter based out of Brooklyn. I like to cover any civil unrest or protest that kind of happens in New York City or the greater Northeast in the United States. So I'll cover events in Boston. I'll cover events in Washington, D.C. I think something that people admire a lot about my work is that I take it to both sides, per se. So right. I covered the riots on January 6th. I wasn't throwing softball questions to people there. I cover Antifa. I cover a lot of Proud Boy stuff. I'll cover a lot of these different culture war topics, and then on to things like global warming. So I really have a nice range of issues that I cover, and it's always an exciting time in New York City when there's civil unrest and protests. Right. So I get a lot of opportunities for content, and it's a good time out there.
Yeah, and what's been your experience covering the current sort of reaction and protests around the current conflict? What's that been like?
It's been an intense past few weeks with the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I need to put things in perspective because a year ago I was covering actual riots in New York City due to the George Floyd trial, where stores were actually being looted, things were actually being set on fire. I've seen that night there were during the George Floyd riots, there was maybe a half dozen NYPD cars that were set on fire, multiple dozen stores robbed, and then a few months later, there were the January 6th riots. So I'm trying to put things in perspective.
Sure.
As far as the Israel-Palestine protests that have been going on in New York City, they've been relatively tame, but had a lot of extremist rhetoric in it. I had a couple of things written down. There were chants at the protests that I covered 2 of them so far. There's actually another one today that I'll be covering. There are regular chants of things like "there is only one solution," "Intifada revolution." And also a complete unwillingness to condemn Hamas. I don't know how far I'm going into the nitty gritty right now, but
as far as you want.
In the West Bank, there's a different government than exists in Gaza. During this most recent conflict, Gaza is trying to assert themselves as a dominant political power, and it seems many American Arabs are supporting that. Right.
What kind of, and in your interviews, when you talk to people, some of the videos that I was watching, there was a lot of like you said, chants about there's only one solution, Intifada revolution. How many people do you think are genuinely aware of what the Intifada has meant, what happened during the Intifada? Or do you think that people know and are willingly saying, no, we're totally fine with the Intifada?
Sham, that's a really good question. And this question, I thought about this question specifically when I had one specific interaction with somebody I came to figure out was a big person on social media. So it's this guy named Adam Saleh who has over 4 million YouTube subscribers or what have you. I wasn't familiar with this guy prior to the protest, but I met him there randomly and interviewed him not knowing he was a social media person. And I asked him specifically, hey, do you support another intifada? And he was just kind of brushing it off, saying, yeah. I asked him more about what that meant, and he couldn't really give me a solid answer. So
Right.
while all these people are calling for an intifada, I don't necessarily know if they know what that means. Because again, in this specific case, when I spoke to this Adam Saleh guy, he was saying like, yeah, we're completely peaceful, but simultaneously calling for an intifada. Some people aren't doing the research
Right.
and it makes their own side look bad. I don't think most actual Palestinians in the Middle East support Hamas, but you'd be hard pressed to find people supporting Palestinians in the United States who don't support Hamas, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, because when it comes to Hamas, the most common argument that I've been hearing in sort of mainstream media, internet media, at least popular internet media, is the whole thing about, all right, look, we know Hamas is bad, we know, but Israel is also bad, but what we need to really think about is not what Hamas is doing. What we really need to think about is, we know Hamas can't beat Israel, so it's incumbent upon Israel about how it reacts. It really shouldn't be, what are a few hundred rockets going to do to Israel? The Iron Dome's going to shoot it down. Let Hamas fire some rockets. Why is Israel responding the way it's responding? Like, that's kind of like the common justification, you can call it, or maybe the response to the violence or the Israeli airstrikes that I'm hearing. To what extent do you sort of get that on the street, and to what extent do you agree with that assessment of the situation?
So there's been a lot of questions that have come up
Mm,
on how ethical it is to attack Hamas officials, knowing that they will use certain people as human shields. The United States has had to deal with like a similar dilemma and has been criticized in a similar manner with the way we used drone strikes,
right.
conducting military exercises in the Middle East, killing terrorists. So while there is criticism to be had of the way Israel conducts itself, and that's obvious, people don't shy away from criticizing Israel. I think it's important not to like be a cultural relativist and like
Yeah.
draw a comparison between Hamas, that is a terrorist organization, and the IDF and the United States that some people do. I'm thinking of somebody specific that used to work for the Young Turks and now works for Sam Seder. I don't know if you know who those people
Mm.
are, but
Yes,
it's
I do.
Emma
I do.
Vigeland actually sent out a
Yes.
tweet yesterday drawing equivalence between Hamas and the United States and the IDF. I think it's completely invalid comparisons. And I think when people draw those similarities, it's leading us down a bad path. As I understand, Palestinians actually know the difference. I think
Right.
it's the far left, socialists, communist, LARPer types who actually believe that the United States is a terrorist country, is a terrorist state, and
Yeah.
similar to that of Hamas. So
Yeah.
I think there's no actual comparison. In Hamas's charter, it explicitly says that they not only want to wipe Israel of all its Jews, they're seeking to wipe out Jews worldwide. If
Right.
able to, Israel would just strike military targets, but Gaza, Hamas knows that in Gaza, using human shields are going to lead us to have conversations like this, and it's a propaganda win for them. They
Yeah.
know there will be useful idiots like Emma Vigeland on our side of the planet, over here in the United States, that'll say things like that and draw that sort of equivalency.
Yeah, and that sort of brings me to another kind of chant and slogan that I've been hearing kind of globally when it comes to the conflict and the protests against the conflict is, and you had supermodel Bella Hadid, who was out in LA, who was chanting the same thing, and it was from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And there's either an attempt out of sheer bias or maybe sheer ignorance of trying to say that, oh, this is actually just a peaceful slogan that means to say that the Palestinian people will be free, they will have the opportunity for self-determination and bring their own government without being under the occupation of Israel. But this chant, this slogan has been used by Hamas, this slogan has been used by PLO leaders, and it's been in the PLO charter for a long time. And when it was in the PLO charter, it was determined very clearly to say that the goal is to get rid of the state of Israel and create the state of Palestine in the entire area. That's what Hamas also very clearly wants to do. So again, we come back to that question, Elad, that is this something that these people know? Do they know what they're saying when they say this slogan, or is it just we know and we're okay with it?
I think a little bit of both exists. I
Right.
think some people know what they're doing. I think many people who perpetuate this ideology in the Middle East kind of know what they're doing. I think there's a lot of people who are just reactionarily anti the United States, anti Israel, therefore by proxy, or also just anti Israel. Also, this situation doesn't exist in a vacuum. The larger Israel-Palestine conflict exists in the larger proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then there's this larger proxy war, if you zoom out a little bit further, between the United States and China, all of which many of these countries are a pawn of. There was some rockets that were set off from Hezbollah in the north towards, we don't know if it was Hezbollah yet, I believe, but it was set off from the north. And not that Hamas is working specifically under the thumb of the Iranians, but they're working in tandem. So they're working towards similar goals, even though they may disagree. I want to say it's around half and half useful idiots and half people who don't know better. But I do think there is something to be said, because a lot of the people who are making these chants, all of them are American citizens, but a lot of them are first-generation immigrants. These are a lot of Arab immigrants who are saying these chants. So that leads me to believe that they aren't, uneducated on this topic. They know something about this. There's something to be said about how in a lot of different Arab cultures, this is an issue that they care about a lot, right? Because before we drew the lines on the map, there was really one Arab population. There are Palestinians who are related to people in Egypt. There are Palestinians who are related to people in Saudi Arabia. So, I think some people know better, and I think others don't. It's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, I can imagine. And, the final thing with regards to this topic as well is when it comes to an issue as complicated and as complex as the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's also interesting for someone like you to go and who is talking to these people on the regular. What has been your impression, in the sense, how much do people actually know about the conflict? Because it's such a long drawn out conflict. How many people actually know that, the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian leadership has over and over again, sort of even after the 93 Oslo Accords, over and over again refused a two-state solution when it's been offered to them? They refused it in 2000, they refused it in 2008, in 2014, in 2020 with Trump, even though, with the Trump one, they didn't even involve the Palestinians in the decision. But still, those are four peace decisions and two-state solutions that have been sort of rebuffed by the Palestinian Authority. And how many people actually know that, time's kind of running out for the Palestinian Authority, that if you don't come to the table, then the opportunity for you to create a proper Palestinian state, that opportunity is getting smaller and smaller. And what has been your impression finally of how many people actually know about the conflict? Because my experience, speaking of India, when I saw the sort of opinions of people in India, but also outside of India, when they're talking about, what's going on in Kashmir, what's going on between India and Pakistan, most people whose knowledge of India is restricted to sort of Bollywood and chicken tikka masala, they're offering opinions about, oh my God, what's happening in Kashmir is so horrible, and look how horrible the Indian government is. Suddenly people that know nothing about India are offering these long-winded rants about how horrible the situation in Kashmir is. So I wondered if that's comparable to people's opinions about the Israel-Palestinian conflict.
I don't think some people know that there's another government with the Fatah and PA in the West Bank. I think some people don't know that exists. I would say many protesters don't know that exists. But I thought of one specific example when you asked me that question. I did interview this one young gentleman who was relatively educated on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I asked him, he said he was seeking a two-state solution. This was a person who told me he's actually Palestinian too, from the West Bank, because a lot of the people, the Arabs who go and support at these protests, they aren't necessarily from the land of what you'd consider Palestine. Many are Yemeni or something else, but I'm getting a little bit off topic. I asked him, he said he wanted a two-state solution. I asked him what borders. He said 67. The 67 borders, and the 67 borders were actually offered to the Palestinians not too long ago. I believe it was Ehud Olmert, please fact check me, who did even offer East Jerusalem as a capital. So it's people who are informed, but I feel like are informed about the things they want to be. And I had one more thing I wanted to say on this
Yeah.
about people being informed about the parts of the conflict that they want to be, because there's a part of the conflict that has affected me and part of why I'm so interested in the conflict.
Right.
So I believe it was 1951. All of my family, my grandparents, are from Iraq, and
Okay.
they were ethnically cleansed from Iraq, and they were forced out. And there were about 800,000 Jews from the Middle East that were essentially ethnically cleansed from the area. There's a reason
Wow.
why there's almost no Jews in Iran. There's almost no Jews in Iraq. There's almost no Jews in Yemen. And that's a part of the conflict that we frequently overlook. So while around the same amount of Palestinians were forced out during the War of Independence, when 6 Arab countries invaded the land of Israel, it's constantly overlooked how many Jews were ethnically cleansed from Arab lands. There are no longer Jews in any of these Middle Eastern countries. And while they even faced greater anti-Semitism in Europe, some Jews still remain there.
Yeah.
So I think there's something to be said about that. While at these protests, there are people yelling, "Go back to Europe" to one another. But half the Jews who make up the current population in Israel actually originate from places in the Middle East. We pick and choose what parts of the conflict we care about.
Right. Yeah. Do you know people know about that? You know, because
when I bring it up to them,
yeah,
when I talk to them about it, then like some of them will kind of remember it. But then they're also like, when you talk to the older people, this is the things that their parents did. So when I'm talking to a guy from Yemen who's 60, well, a guy from Yemen who's 60 probably doesn't even know. So I live in New York City. I live in a part of Brooklyn. There are many Yemeni people here who own bodegas and stuff like that. I have a Yemeni friend who's like in his 30s. He didn't know there were any Jews in Yemen.
Wow.
So it's just like there's a lot of this cognitive dissonance, and people again care about the issues they care about. The Middle East is a place with almost no justice. Okay, there's a ton of terrorism. There's a ton of death in the Middle East all the time. The real question is, why do we only pick and choose about the issues and things that we care about, and when to care about them?
Right, exactly. It's a bit of soft bigotry of low expectations, you know. And it's very interesting you mentioned the Arab Jew part, because the discussion in a large measure that I've seen from a certain section of politicians and obviously from the general population and commentariat as well has been a very concerted attempt to connect the Israel-Palestine conflict to sort of Black Lives Matter and police brutality sort of narrative. So they're saying, you know, just like the evil whites in America are sort of oppressing the blacks through the use of the police, the evil whites in Israel are suppressing the poor Arabs through the use of the IDF and the military personnel. Not knowing the fact that a very large percentage of the population of Israel is Arab, either Jews or non-Jewish Arabs. So when you factor that in, that narrative doesn't necessarily work, but it doesn't stop people, does it?
It doesn't stop people at all. It's actually kind of funny because at these events, it's literally people. I have a clip of both sides just yelling at each other to go back to Europe. It's just like, you go back to Europe. No, you go back to Europe. I also kind of keep in mind here that both the Jewish diaspora and Palestinian diaspora in the United States are probably actually uninterested in going back to the Middle East. My parents are Israeli. They came to America. They don't have any plans of immigrating back. I don't have any plans of immigrating back. I spoke to a couple of the Palestinians that I, off the record, spoke to about this issue, said they're not going back. So it's again interesting how we're fighting so hard for these issues on the other side of the planet that we don't really even want to bear the fruit from.
Right.
So there's a lot of complex layers to this. One thing I did want to mention that we haven't really brought up yet is the I don't know how to say this right. There's been some violence at these events, and there's been some anti-Semitism at some of these other Free Palestine events worldwide. During my most recent event that I covered, it was a little bit less than a week ago in New York City. There were a few thousand Free Palestine protesters organizing outside the Israeli consulate. They marched across the city. Apparently, they came across a Jewish man. This Jewish man apparently voiced his displeasures. I can't even
Right.
get a hard source on this because the people who recorded it, the Free Palestine protesters, aren't releasing the footage. There were verbal words exchanged, obviously very harsh things. This
Right.
led to one person in the crowd throwing a metal chair at the man who was talking
Wow.
trash to them. They then proceeded to mob and chase this man. He was bleeding profusely from his head. The NYPD had to lock this man in a store.
Right.
So there's been
Yeah.
some violence. I'm not going to directly call that an anti-Semitic attack, but then I know in Europe there have been a lot of anti-Semitic chants that have
Yeah,
been chanted.
particularly in London, man. It's been crazy. Like
Have
the
you seen that
protests
clip
in
of
London.
that one caravan of cars encouraging people
Yeah.
to like rape Jewish women or
Yep.
something like that?
Yep.
And these are in countries that are supposed to, be enlightened countries of liberty, right?
Right.
The UK, in the United States. These aren't the areas where we expect to see that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then I think we see, some of the uninterested people who live in these countries saying,
Right.
what is going on? Why is there so much? Well, I think they've always kind of had this conflict and seen this, but this uprising in this kind of tension between these immigrant communities in their country, it gets very complicated.
Yeah, it does. It does. And it is on the one hand kind of a shame to watch, people in Britain, London particularly, that call themselves liberals, enlightened liberals, sort of just go along with these kind of chants. There was another chant I remember, I think it was in London as well. I think Andy No shared a video of this where the chant was basically, the crowd was basically chanting something like Jews remember the armies of Muhammad or something like that, which is a pretty clear indication of what we want to do to the Jews if we are able to. That's as clear as you can get. And you have in the same crowd where this was being chanted, you had a bunch of white liberals just walking along, chanting Free Palestine and stuff like that, just seemingly completely blissfully unaware of the context of this phrase and of the meaning of this phrase that these people are chanting. And I was thinking to myself, man, it must be really great to be like a British liberal, because you can talk about the problems with like settler colonialism in Israel and colonialism in Kashmir by India and all of that stuff, while at the same time you get to enjoy the fruits of colonization of your own ancestors. And half an hour on Saturday, you get to go hit the streets, decry Israel, decry India, feel good, come back and go to the museums and watch all the artifacts that were collected by your ancestors and now they're, sort of making all these millions of dollars off of. So being a British liberal must be a blissful existence.
It's really interesting. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I feel like one very lowbrow, obvious form of hypocrisy that exists at a lot of these events is that there are a lot of support for this movement in the LGBT community. So at a lot of these protests, for example, the one I went to a few days ago, there was like a queers for Palestine. There is like multiple Muslim, Jewish, anti-fascist factions. Yeah. I think you kind of touched on this earlier with how a lot of these, it's a part of intersectionality, how this is also mixing with Black Lives Matters. I also saw a sign at one of these events that said Palestinian Lives Matter. It's just interesting because all the people who are pushing this intersectional stuff, pushing the anti-fascist stuff at these events, pushing the LGBT stuff at these events, these weren't the typical Arabs I would expect to be protesting at a Free Palestine event doing this. It was white liberals, gay white leftists, and something like that. So it is something to take into consideration. I did want to mention one other thing here with how we're comparing how different protests are occurring in different countries in response to this. There is something to be said about how we do have different forms of government that may not necessarily be compatible with different areas of the world yet. So we have our nice liberal democracy here in the Western world that had time to mature, and that had the basis from the basic laws in the UK, and we Americans certainly had a head start. And in the UK, they had hundreds of years of being an empire and establishing their countries well. A lot of this infrastructure wasn't done as well in a lot of countries in the Middle East. I don't know if all those countries are ready for democracy to the degree that they're getting it, or we're trying to force it upon them. There's also something to say here about how Turkey's behaving in all of this, with Turkey trying to act like how somehow they are, they're fighting for the legitimacy of Islam, essentially.
Yeah, Erdogan's trying to be the new caliph. kind of.
Yeah, they're saying they're defending the al-aqsa mosque, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what Erdogan's been saying. Their form of government's been very interesting. Nobody seems to care about when he airstrikes Armenians in northern Syria. Nobody really cares. But now he's the defender of Islam and humanity. Now Erdogan cares about human rights, not when he's bombing, innocent innocent Kurds, rather, not Armenians. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
the whole Middle East, so crazy. So many layers to this stuff. So many smaller proxies going on.
Yeah, and there's hardly any mention of that. Have you seen that? So let me.
There's some Turks. There were some Turks at a lot of these events.
Oh, were there?
Yeah, there were some Turks.
What
again, Erdogan's a dictator. So this guy's. Sorry about that. What'd you say?
No. I said, what was their opinion on the matter?
I didn't directly interview any of them, but there was more than a non-zero amount of support. There were flags of Turkey at some of these events.
Right.
I think this is something that unites the immigrant Arab community extremely well in places that are outside of the Middle East. Some of the biggest protests we're seeing here in the United States are some of the most Arab places in the United States. Right. This is Bay Ridge of Brooklyn, this kind of southern Brooklyn. We've been seeing some of the most of this unrest in like Minnesota, which has a very large Arab immigrant community. So like that's kind of been bringing them together. I know I've been talking a little bit about geopolitics too, but it's interesting because Saudi Arabia seems to have abandoned the Palestinian issue, and a couple of other countries
UAE.
in the Middle East just signed peace deals with the United States. And guess what? Nobody cares, but none of those countries have had anything to say about this conflict yet. While every other democracy we're forcing to issue a statement, Saudi Arabia hasn't said a word. I don't think the UAE has said a word yet. It's interesting because these are the countries that had peace treaties declared recently with with Israel.
Yeah, and I do think that it would be detrimental to certain particularly an organization like Hamas, an organization like Hezbollah, countries like Turkey, countries like Iran, countries like Qatar. It'll be detrimental to these countries and these organizations if the Israel-Palestine problem actually got solved. If there was a general sense of peace between Israel and other Arab countries in the region, like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, like UAE and things like that. Because for obviously Hamas and Hezbollah, their entire existence depends upon this conflict. They need this conflict to survive.
Often than not, it's enriching their leaders.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. Many of the NGOs that work in these areas as well, that go work on the ground in Palestine and that are supporting, Palestinians and Palestinian sort of struggle for freedom and all that stuff. Many of these non-governmental organizations that get a lot of great funding, by the way, they're very well-to-do non-governmental organizations. They're completely and fully dependent on the perpetuation of this conflict as well. So there are a lot of parties, like you said, Turkey, similarly, Iran, all these NGOs, Hezbollah, Hamas, all of these parties are extremely interested in the continuous perpetuation of this conflict, because the end of the conflict means that all the money dries up. The end of the conflict means that they're struggling for existence, essentially, right?
Yeah. While I wholeheartedly agree with every one of those that you listed, I think you left out one. There's an arms industry interested in perpetuating what's going on, not only in the United States, but in Israel. And I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but the reason that Israel has their large arms industry is because of the economic pressures placed on them since their inception. So that's what kind of developed in Israel. Now they have an extremely powerful arms industry. And now oftentimes, after many failed attempts at trying to reconcile with the Palestinians, many actual Israelis in Israel, because I know those are the people who are constantly overlooked here. We never really think about what actual Israelis think, even though they're the people electing their officials. But a lot of Israelis are deeply bitter about these multiple wars not too long ago that they had to fight. And some of these surprise wars, we talk about how sometimes this turns into a religious conflict. Not too long ago, many Arab countries declared war on Israel and the Jews on their most holy day, on Yom Kippur. So these are very, in many cases, resentful populations towards one another. And then Israel has this arms industry that now really allows it to have the upper leg in this situation. Also, the
Right.
United States obviously helps here. One thing that bothers me that I hear a lot is that Israel and Palestine are not on the equal footing militarily.
Yeah.
Therefore, Israel should stop. But I don't understand how that makes sense, because guess what? When powers are on equal footing, that just is what leads to a lot more casualties.
Yes.
So I believe it was 20 or 30 years ago when Iran and Iraq were on similar footing in the Middle East, right? They had similar military capabilities.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that countries don't go to war. When countries have similar military capabilities, they could still go to war, but then they just end up with a lot more casualties. In the Iraq-Iran war, I think there was something like a million casualties on both sides, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
A huge loss of life. Again, this is something that we just overlook. Now, if 50 people die in Gaza because of this conflict, it's a different story, and human rights organizations care a whole lot more. It's just, again, shifting standards for what we decide to care about.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like saying that if you're stronger, you should not defend yourself, which is a very silly argument. I don't understand that argument at all. Like,
No,
if a person who's like half your size comes at you with a knife, you should not defend yourself. Like,
if I have a gun which is 10 times more powerful than the person with the knife, and the person with the knife is still charging at me,
yeah,
I should still pump
shoot him.
the whole clip into him. So because again, these a lot of people argue this with the United States too.
Yeah.
When we impose our military will on other countries, it's a good thing to be militarily dominant over another country. And the doctrine that Israel uses is actually the same doctrine that the United States uses, and that's a doctrine of deterrence.
Right.
The United States does this with Iran as well. It was Iran who, this was going on for a tit for tat for a while, but I believe it was Iran who not too long ago hit one of our tankers or hit one of our bases, and we just killed Qasem Soleimani, and now we're still waiting for their, actual response. But we have a policy of deterrence here, and the United States does the same thing. We're not on equal playing field. We shouldn't try to have a long, drawn out conflict. We should try to get it solved and nip it in the bud to prevent escalation.
Yeah, speaking of geopolitics, since we're talking geopolitics, the response of politicians in America has been very interesting as well. I'm not as familiar with the response within the Democratic Party, if it's been like, different responses, because from the leaders that I've seen in the Republican Party, speak about this, they've been relatively unequivocally supportive of Israel in it. The response of the Democratic Party has also been very interesting, where they're sort of playing both sides of the field. You have Biden, who comes out and says, Israel has the right to defend itself, we stand with Israel. But then you have this another fairly influential section within the Democratic Party known as the Squad, where you have AOC, you have Rashida Tlaib, you have Ilhan Omar, and all their friends and allies, who are openly calling this a genocide, who are openly calling this apartheid, who are openly calling this the worst form of racism, sort of the worst form of violence, who are the ones perpetuating this narrative that Israel should not be defending itself against the attacks that are coming their way. This is a very interesting, I don't know if this is a strategy. It feels like a strategy where the sort of more senior leaders stand with Israel, whereas the more radical leaders just go and shit on Israel. Do you think this is kind of a strategy? Do you think it sends a weird mixed message?
It's funny that you bring up AOC, and we were talking so much earlier about people talking about the conflict who actually don't know much. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, I believe, know a lot about the conflict and perpetuate lies about it on purpose. Rashida Tlaib has a history of, trying to demonize the people of Israel for crimes they aren't responsible for all the time. I believe Rashida Tlaib is from the West Bank. But as far as AOC goes, I think she's one of those people who just doesn't know a lot about the conflict and is just kind of doing what she says. I'm happy to say that I actually believe that this is actually a fringe element in the Democrat Party that is not supportive of Israel. A lot of people say that the future of the party is people like Ilhan, is people like Rashida Tlaib. I actually don't believe so. I believe there are a lot of those are the people who get a lot of the attention, but there are people like Richie Torres, who is actually a representative from the Bronx close to me, who's one of the most who is a new member of the House, and is actually still one of the strongest pro-Israel people in the House. I still think there's
Andrew Yang
consensus.
too, like he's running for mayor of New York, but he was pretty unequivocal that Israel has a right to defend itself,
Yeah,
even though
Andrew Yang came out being very pro Israel. He actually, in the past, he penned an op-ed comparing BDS to like Nazi Germany with how they were
Right.
boycotting Jewish businesses. So it's really interesting. But I still think there's a bipartisan consensus that supports Israel, and I think that'll remain. I think Israel is still like 75% popular in
Right.
the United States, but it is worth mentioning that there are fringe elements in both political parties that are anti-Israel, and this is overlaid with a lot of people who are also, it's not the same people, but some of
Right.
the same people who are anti-Israel are also just isolationists, which is just a different political ideology. America being the world hegemon right now is kind of, the isolationists kind of want to withdraw back in a little bit, and that
Right.
could kind of also be interpreted as an anti-Israel stance. But for now, those are fringe elements in the party, and we hope it remains that way.
What do you make of this? Because I was reading somewhere, and I think I saw, I think on the Young Turks as well, was something that I saw when they were talking about. So I'm a millennial, but I hear that the Gen Zs are a lot more sort of left leaning and a lot more extreme in their sort of left leaning ideologies, and they're a lot more anti-Israel. They're a lot more pro-Palestine, and they're a lot more supportive of politicians like AOC, Ilhan Omar, and such and such. What do you, in your experience, sort of just being out on the street, do you notice that at all? That the generation sort of coming in after the millennials, they seem to be a bit more extreme.
We mentioned this earlier too, about how the intersectionality of this layers one upon itself. I do keep a close eyes on a lot of different reporters who report on protests here, a lot of different organizers who organize these protests, of course. Typically, there isn't a lot of tension when they try to promote events or talk about events in their posts and whatnot. But I actually did see a good amount of pushback with the usual progressives that fall in line with all issues, choose to take a stand when it comes to some of these, when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Right.
And I guess what I'm getting at here is that a lot of the progressive people in a lot of these towns are Jews, and a lot of these Jews stay pro-Israel, even though that isn't supposedly the optimal left thing to do.
Right.
And while I do think approval for Israel has been decreasing in the United States, it hasn't been decreasing significantly.
Right.
I think we're going from like 90% popularity to like 75% popularity.
Okay.
90% was unsustainable. For the past 30 years, the United States has been one of the most pro-Israel countries that has existed.
In the world,
Before
yeah,
that,
for
it was
sure.
France. But, for the past 30 years, there's been that consensus in the United States. As long as America continues to be the world hegemon, countries like Israel, countries like Taiwan, countries like India, countries like Brazil, countries like all the countries in Europe, countries like South Korea are still going to be at the forefront, and these are going to be allies that we will need to stand up with, that a lot of these people like Rashida Tlaib, like Ilhan Omar, like AOC will throw shade against very often. But these are our close allies that usually stand for our ideas of liberty, for our ideas of free markets, that we need to stand with and stand strong with.
Yeah, and speaking from the sort of Israeli side in this conflict as well, did you get a chance to cover? You said there were some protesters that were pro-Israel as well. Did you get a chance to talk to them?
I didn't get to speak to any on the record. I spoke to a couple off the record. The reason for that is scale. So like at this Free Palestine protest, there were 2,000, maybe 3,000 protesters.
Wow.
And then of the Israeli counter demonstrators, maybe a dozen or so, maybe less.
Wow.
That's something it's significant too, because New York City has one of the largest Jewish populations outside of Israel. I think we have approximately close to 2 million Jews here in the city.
Wow.
Large communities here. They didn't they didn't show up to counter demonstrate. That doesn't mean they don't care about the issue.
Sure.
One of the protesters actually mocked me when I was asking about that. Why he said why there's so few counter demonstrators, but for the dozen or so that was there, they were relatively rowdy. These protests get violent. There's going to be yelling matches. There's going to be like little skirmishes. Sometimes it gets a little bit more violent, but it gets violent. I think that keeps a lot of people away. A lot of people that also care about these issues, they're not the usual protesters. They're like families. The people who are, Zionists in America and in New York City, they're people with jobs, people with families. They go visit more of their family in Israel, and being on the street doesn't seem like what we're usually up to.
Yeah, that's fair. And when you get a chance to talk to these guys, what is because one of the most contentious things, sort of claims that are made against Israel, tends to be the settlements. They talk about, it's building all these settlements, and the continuous building of the settlements is making the two-state solution nearly impossible. That's one of the most common charges that are sort of filed against the Israeli side and the Israeli actions. What are their responses generally to that accusation that the settlements are making the two-state solution unviable?
As far as Israeli politics goes, settlements is actually fairly unpopular, as I understand. I believe the right wing in Israel, it's a controversial issue. The center left on Israel is completely anti-settlement, and the right in Israel has also made it clear that they are actually willing to pull settlements out for peace. Avigdor Lieberman is one of the leading not a leading politician, but an influential politician in Israel, actually lives in a settlement in the West Bank and has been put on the record saying that he's actually willing to leave his settlement for peace. One thing that's important to note here, I believe, is that the Israelis actually pulled their settlements out of Gaza. I don't know how many people know this about the conflict, but there are actually settlements in Gaza. The Israelis decided to pull out those settlements because they were anticipating, better relations. Hamas ended up taking control of Gaza, and now that's where they launch rockets from. So, Israelis, there's a history here of Israelis pulling out their settlements and it not leading to peace. One other part about this issue that I don't like that people talk about is that we're never, there isn't really ever a question whether or not there isn't going to be any Arabs in the Israeli state. There will be Arabs in the Israeli state, and
there already are.
Most of the Israelis are completely okay with that. There are fringe elements that aren't, but they're never going to get enough power to actually do anything about it. And ethnically cleansing, in our current democracy of Israel, not during a war or a conflict, just to kick people out is wrong, and that's not going to happen. There's never that thought on Israeli settlers in the West Bank, because what if a future Palestinian state just annexed those settlements and then just had a certain amount of their population that was Jewish? It would actually lead to roughly the same amount of it would be like a parity of the percent of Arabs in Israel to the percent of Jews in Palestine, if that makes sense. But no, apparently if there is a Palestinian state, we can have 0 Jews in it. So I don't know what the deal is.
That is a good point, actually. I didn't think about it that way, that, you have do you think that would be something that I find it difficult, given the 2000?
The reason I say this, the reason that I bring things like that up is because my family was kicked out of Iraq, and before it got unpopular there was a Nazi regime that eventually became more influential in Iraq and actually persecuted the Jews there, a Nazi-aligned government. In Iraq during the early 1950s and late 1940s. But prior to that, in some Middle Eastern countries, Jews actually had better relationships with their population there than in other countries. Wow. So Jews had a great relationship with the Iraqis in the early 1900s. In the late 1800s, Baghdad was a world-renowned city where Jews prospered. I think it was something like a third of the population in Baghdad was Jewish. Some of the most influential people in Iraq were Jewish. So Jews were able to thrive in these Arab lands. So that's why, I don't know why there has to be no Jews in any of these countries. In any of these Middle Eastern countries, why does there have to be Jews? There shouldn't have to be, because from Babylon, from Baghdad, that's where many of us Jews came from.
Would the Jewish population that lives in these settlements in the West Bank, do you have any sense of if they would actually accept a situation like that, where a two-state solution happened and the settlements don't really move or go away, and the people that are living in these settlements in the West Bank just become citizens of a Palestinian state? Do you think that there will ever be a situation? Yeah.
But I like the idea. I don't think Israeli citizens would feel safe, or the
Right.
Palestinian citizens feel safe. But in a future Palestinian state, I think they should guarantee things like liberty. I think
Yeah,
all
of
states
course.
should guarantee safety of
Yeah.
their citizens. And
Yeah.
there's no reason to necessarily exile these people. But Avigdor Lieberman, again, a person who lives, a politician who lives in these settlements, has said he's willing to leave. But in the past, leaving these settlements hasn't led to peace. So again, you have, from the perspective of the Israeli, it's like, hey, we left Gaza, Hamas took over, and now they send rockets. It's like, why would we do the exact same thing here
Right,
in the West Bank?
right. Yeah, it's that once bitten, twice shy thing, right? And
Yeah.
that's where I feel like the onus needs to be, to an extent, on the Palestinian Authority as well, to make certain promises to the world and to the Jewish people living in the West Bank and to the Israelis in general that, look, there are certain things that we're going to guarantee. If there's going to be a Palestinian state, certain things are going to be completely and utterly non-negotiable. And until those non-negotiables are on the table, you can't really blame the Israelis for not negotiating or not buying into the empty promises of the Palestinian authorities, because that's what they've been so far. They've been empty promises. When you talk about an independent state, liberation, and all of that stuff, what will that liberation entail for the small Jewish population that are going to be living in those countries?
It's a complicated situation. I think the eventual, when this conflict does come to a head, I don't think the settlements will remain, and I believe this is one of the. I think this is one of the many negotiating tools.
Wow.
There's like a dozen issues, whether it be Jerusalem, whether it be Palestinians in Jordan coming back, Palestinians in Lebanon coming back, Jews from other countries continuing to come back. It's very tense. But again, I don't know what the viable solution here is. I still think the thing that makes the most sense is an annexation of Gaza by Egypt and an annexation of the parts of the West Bank by Jordan. These are countries already with substantial Palestinian populations,
right,
and these cultures are similar, as I understand.
Right.
So it's a very complicated conflict, but I don't think there's a solution here until the next world conflict happens. And I think that's the truth for a lot of these smaller skirmishes that we're seeing around the world. So I think, as I know I'm getting a bit geopolitical here,
right.
I think as the United States begins to pull out of places like the Middle East, we're seeing the rise of other powers trying to maneuver, and that's going to lead conflicts to come to a resolution. So I'm kind of saying that, like, the Israel-Palestine conflict will come to a head once Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia decide to iron out the issues and come to a head. I think India and Pakistan and China will come to a decision with what has to come down in Kashmir, whether it's through diplomacy or force, when America slowly pulls out. With Armenia and Azerbaijan and Russia and what's going on with the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I think, again, once the United States pulls out more, they become more isolationist, don't remain the world's hegemony anymore. More people feel more comfortable to call the shots in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, that is going to be tricky. So you don't see, a non-conflict sort of resolution to the current stalemate that exists between Israel and Palestine.
So war is diplomacy by other means, and diplomacy has clearly failed. So we have to, the other means are the only ones available. I think Lebanon is not Lebanon. I think Iran is using Lebanon and the West Bank and parts and Hezbollah as a proxy. So I don't think Iran is going to stop that. I think there's going to be a conflict with Iran sometime in the future because of the regime that exists there. But then there are also the religious fanatics in the House of Saud with what's going on in Saudi Arabia. Erdogan's a dictator.
Yeah.
Who knows? The Middle East is, I don't foresee peace in the Middle East.
Not anytime soon. Yeah, that much is for sure. Not anytime soon. And I do think
I think that's a consequence of American, again, we're coming on the heels of the long peace since World War II.
Right.
And I believe it's as America retreats and people feel less scared and don't always listen to what America has to say. America is kind of the parent, in my mind, the parent that's been keeping everybody more or less in order. Not completely, but more or less.
Yeah, it is interesting. I'm not entirely sure how it's going to play out as well. And especially, I think the religious aspect of it doesn't get talked about enough, but it is something that needs to be talked about, and it is something that rightly gives the Jews living in the West Bank, if the West Bank were to become an independent country, it gives them pause for thought and it makes them uncomfortable, because even if people make the claims that, oh, this Palestinian state will be different, or the new Middle East will be different, or the new Pakistan, whatever, will be different, the track record and the history of the past 1400 years unfortunately tells a very different stories. That when in these countries there are certain populations that are minorities, they're made certain promises, but those promises are never fulfilled. In fact, things go quite radically in the opposite direction. So I think when people are protesting out in the streets and when people are complaining about the evil things that I think Israel is doing, I think this aspect of the entire debate, this aspect of the entire discussion really does not get a mention at all.
I foresee a future Palestinian state where it's a worse place to be an Arab than in Israel proper, being an Israeli Arab citizen. I already believe, for the most part, Israeli Arab citizens have a better life in Israel than almost any other place in the Middle East where Arab countries have their society, unless you're obviously an elite. But
right.
For the average everyday person, you have more opportunity to prosper, you have more rights, you have more liberty in Israel as an Arab Israeli citizen, which I believe is like 20% of the population in Israel.
Right. Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting. Some of the stuff.
One other thing that I thought was interesting. I know we've been talking a lot about Israel and geopolitics here, and how a lot of these different issues intersect. Another double standard that I hear people talk about is the double standard that Erdogan's saying that he's fighting for Muslims across the world. Iran, again, is fighting for the legitimacy of being the person who's fighting for Islam and the rightful crown to this.
Right.
But again, the double standard is the conflicts and genocides they choose to overlook because of geopolitical consequences. And I don't know if you know what I'm alluding to, but it's the genocide of the Uyghurs right now in China that, again, people have talked about, but it's interesting to compare conflicts and see what certain countries are willing to say and what they aren't willing to say, depending on who's perpetrating the issue. And what a lot of Israel defenders often talk about is the double standard that they believe Israel is held to.
Right.
And not too many of these same countries that are speaking out against Israel happen to be speaking out against China. So again, we have different standards here.
Yeah, I mean, you look at China and what's going on with the Uyghurs there. You look at I think the death toll now up to 60 or something. The terrorist attack that happened in Afghanistan, where terrorists targeted a all-girls school and they murdered 60 little girls. And it's nowhere in the news. Nobody seems to be protesting against the horrible, horrible terrorist organization that is Taliban. I've never seen a scale of protest against the Taliban that we see against a country like Israel on sort of a regular basis. I've never seen that. You don't see protests against the murder and the continued discrimination against the Shias, the Ahmadiyas, and the Hazaras in Pakistan. You don't see that at all. I've never seen a protest against, speak up for Hazaras, Hazara lives matter, or Yazidi lives matter, or Christian lives matter in Pakistan. Nothing like that.
Or the righteous cause of the Kurds in the area, too, who've been, stateless for so long.
Yeah.
There are terrorist attacks regularly all throughout the Middle East. Crickets. And this is Muslim on Muslim violence. This is the conflict between Sunnis
that's why it doesn't
Shia.
Get mentioned. Right. That's why it doesn't get talked about, because it's Muslim on Muslim violence. Because then if you talk about it, then it leads to some very uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah. One other big part about this that we have yet to mention is that the Israelis are closing in on their, I believe, 5th election in 2 years. So I mentioned earlier in the stream how Hamas is fighting for legitimacy against Fatah in order to try to be elected in the West Bank when they eventually have elections, which they haven't in 14 years. But the Israeli politicians are in a similar struggle, fighting to gain power. So they're in a political crisis where they can't form a government. The Israel system, I believe, is similar to the parliamentary system in the UK. I don't know how familiar you are, but they need to build a coalition and they're unable to get a majority to do so.
Okay.
and they're close to their fourth election. They're failing to build a coalition government. So a political crisis is happening in Israel where all these politicians are again vying for influence. Benjamin Netanyahu, supposed king of Israel, has been in power forever there now, is still trying to see if he could pull out another trick out of his hat here, because it seems as though he's been failing to gain a coalition. Again, this conflict could help exacerbate more support for Netanyahu because he's often been times looked at as like the protector of the state.
Yeah. So what is happening there? So very finally, before we get out of here, like what is happening in Israel with the government as well? Because Netanyahu has been given some time to form a majority or something, right? He did not have enough votes to form the government, but he's been given time to form a majority and create a coalition to form the government. How long do you get to be able to do that?
I believe it's like a month or so. The thing that I think is super interesting about the history of Israeli politics is that the first 30 years, the left completely dominated Israeli politics, completely dominated. The right didn't even exist in Israel, completely collapsed. Nobody cared. But then following, I forgot exactly which war it was, the right began dominating. And then ever since, I forgot exactly which would you consider, prime minister.
Which was Golda Meir?
Golda Meir was a leftist. Golda Meir was, really? I believe she called herself a socialist. She was like, she was part of the Socialist Party, all that. Up until, I believe, Yitzhak Rabin is when the left began to fall apart. And then ever since then, the past 20 or 30 years or so, the right has absolutely dominated.
So sort of coincided with the rise of Hamas.
So, pretty much. But there's something to be said about like the center in Israel is a center right. Almost. So it's a very rightward shift in the politics, and that we are seeing, different. It's a very diverse population in Israel. There's like religious versus non-religious, Arabs versus non-Arabs, Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi when it comes to these voting patterns. But it is a firmly right-wing country, and I do think that Netanyahu, I don't think they're going to be able to form a government in this election. They already voted. Nobody's going to be able to form a sizable coalition. But once this conflict is not said and done, but once they have another election, I don't think the conflict's ending before then. More conflict only leads to more people becoming rightward, more defensive, caring more about national security, because in Israel, they don't look at this as an international conflict. This is a domestic conflict where people are launching rockets at my house.
Yeah.
So you care about national defense. You care about somebody who says they're going to defend Israel by any means. Yeah. A ground invasion isn't as controversial in Israel as it is in America because they're the people whose houses are being fired at, and they want to quell the violence that's coming towards them.
I mean, if I read something crazy, I think it was on the IDF Twitter. I don't know how accurate it is, but they said 70% of Israelis had to go hide in bomb shelters over the weekend. Imagine if 70% of Americans had to go hide in bomb shelters because Mexico fired rockets. There would be an American flag in every major Mexican city by the end of the week.
We see a rightward shift during times of war. We become more patriotic after national conflicts. After 9/11, there was, we completely allowed our government to do whatever the hell they wanted. We allowed them to pass the Patriot Act. That's how patriotic we become. We heard Patriot Act and we thought, hey, no question asked. Every, I believe, senator signed off on stuff like this. So during tense times of war, when your life, your government, your country is threatened, people become more nationalistic, and it's a very tense powder keg situation in the Middle East that unfortunately, I don't think there's a quick, easy, peaceful solution soon. Who knows though? I hear there are talks about a ceasefire coming soon, but I have my fingers crossed. We'll see.
Yeah, I do hope the violence stops, but because as much as we can all point fingers at who's wrong and who's right, at the end of the day, in conflicts like these, often innocent people die, either in Israel or in Gaza. So I think that's important to consider as well. And I also kind of agree with you. I don't know if there's a quick fix to a situation like this, if there's an easy solution to a situation like this, particularly considering the narratives that are spread about this conflict sort of across the globe. But we'll see how that develops, and maybe we'll have you back and we can chat about this again at some time.
I'd love to.
But thanks today, Elad. Thanks for taking the time out and speaking to me on the show today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sham, so much for having me on. I'd love to be back again if you'd have me. It's been a pleasure talking to you, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And stick around with me offline for a second. But guys, again, you can go follow Elad. His YouTube channel is in the description down below. He does a lot of fun man on the street style videos. He talks to a lot of people that are protesting. So if you want to see some of those cool videos, go check out his YouTube channel. It's in the description as usual. Again, if you like today's episode, make sure to leave a like, leave a thumbs up, abuse us in the comments, all of that fun stuff. It all helps the algorithm. So go ahead and do that. If you like the show, subscribe as usual. This will be available as a podcast later on. So keep an eye out for that. Well, ear out for that one as well. We will see you on Thursday for the Thursday podcast. Until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and we will see you guys next time